Chapter 16. Consequence.
The night had set in, and Taylor throttled his bike down a bit as he rode through the residential neighborhood toward the H-Rock. Not so much because he could not ride faster, but part of him wanted to take as long as he could before he arrived. It was cold. Utah definitely heading into winter now. The skies looked dreary and gray. Snow would come soon. Taylor sighed. Before all this had happened, he would have been melancholy around this time of year, the impending snow causing him to give up his bike for another winter. He smiled a bit, thinking about all the things he now had on his plate. All the things that had happened made that seem so trivial and far away. This would be the last step out of his old life. When Scott was gone, no vestige of his old life would remain. Amy and him would be the only things left, and they were hardly what you would call unchanged or untouched. He again questioned why him, but no answer came. The same thing happened every time he thought the question. He had read so much at the library under Amsterdam about people dealing with their position in life. Taylor knew the thoughts he should put into practice. However, the one thing the books cannot teach you to do is how you feel. Taylor felt as if he was being pulled apart from the inside out. He honestly did not know how much more he could take. He wanted to push himself forward, but his heart bled and the pain was unbearable. He shook off the thought. Later, he said to himself. He questioned his and Amy's choice, a million arguments running through his head. But one thing rang clear and true. Scott would never be able to live with himself if he were to know what he was doing. Taylor believed Scott would have done the same thing to and for him. He had to believe that. One thing was clear. Taylor was about to face the hardest responsibility of his life. His nerves grew the closer he got. It needed to be done. For Tiffany, for Amy, for Taylor, and even for Scott. Taylor set his jaw in grim determination. He knew Scott would return here. However, if you were to ask him how he knew that, he would not be able to tell you. He rode up the steep hills, trying to gain control over his emotions as he controlled the bike through the sharp turns of the mountain roads. Even though this would hurt him deeply, he knew he would have to act swiftly and without showing his emotion. Lately, that was becoming more and more tricky for him. He used to be so level-headed, so confident. Now that had all been changed. Taylor had been shaken to his very core on more than one occasion in the recent past. Taylor rounded the last corner and rode the last street up the trailhead. Taylor pulled into the circle next to the trail, the mountain looming in the background. There was a black bullet bike in the circle. He must have known I would come, Taylor said to himself. He got off his bike and took off his helmet and looked toward the trail. He hung his helmet on the handlebars and started the short hike to the base of the H-Rock. He looked up the hill. Scott was up there. He could feel it. He jogged up the gravel hill. He looked up at the H-Rock. Again, memories flooding through him. The many hikes they had taken, the years they had spent together, the commitment that they would never leave each other. Taylor grimaced. He pulled his emotions in. He was here to do a job, no matter how difficult it would be. If he wavered even for a moment, he may never be able to do it. He saw a shadow pass as he approached the giant rock. He stopped and looked up, the clouds looming very close. "Scott, come out," Taylor said boldly. Scott stood up and looked down at him. "Why can't you leave me the fuck alone?" Scott growled at him. Normally, it would have taken some time to scale the rock, but Taylor did it in 3 hops. In the next second, he stood directly in front of Scott, atop the rock. "Because, Scott, you're gone. You've gone way off the deep end," Taylor said. "Oh, fuck you. Stop trying to save me," Scott returned, shocked that he had climbed up so quickly. Scott was full of rage at everything and everyone, including Taylor. "I'm not here to save you," Taylor stated. Scott was taken back. He had expected Taylor to come after him, but he had never expected him to end him. He recovered as quick as he could. "Fine," Scott said. He reached out to make an attack, however, Taylor was much faster. Taylor grabbed Scott's arm and flung him off the rock to the gravel face below. He jumped off the rock and landed a few feet from his crumpled friend. "Why, Scott?" Taylor's eyes flared red with anger, and a wave of power flooded Scott. "Oh, fuck you, Taylor. Don't ask me to justify myself if you're here to kill me." Scott spat out blood as he got to his feet. "You don't get to know why. This isn't one of your fucking books." Scott sneered back at him. Taylor again had to hold his emotion back. Scott was wild, his eyes glowing red, his hair disheveled. He wore a dark trench coat. He was taking on the role of a monster. Scott felt that that's what he was, and he could no longer hold back the urges that overcame him. Taylor wanted to see his friend one last time. He looked into his eyes for some sign of his friend, but Scott had already left. He desperately wanted to pour out his feelings to Scott. Taylor knew the cold look in Scott's eyes was not him. Taylor screamed in his mind for another way. None came. Taylor hit Scott in the face with the back of his palm, causing his neck to snap back hard. He again fell to the ground. "This isn't going to end well for you," Taylor said. Taylor's mind floated to the moment in the past when the two had met. Taylor looked around the library. His mother had dropped him off. They were having story time, which Taylor loved. His mother was on the lower levels, shifting through her own interests. They were early, and Taylor looked at some books. He leafed through one. "I didn't like that one very much," a young blond boy said, smiling. "My name's Taylor," he said, smiling. "Do you like books?" Taylor asked hopefully. "Yeah." "Do you like motorcycles?" Scott asked. "Yeah," Taylor said. And that was all she wrote. They were forever friends. Years passed, and Scott and Taylor used each other for support. Taylor sighed as he slipped back into the present. Taylor wanted to scream. "How could I do this?" Taylor pleaded with himself. Blood streamed from Scott's nose. He was covered with dirt. Again Scott struggled to his feet. He stood staring at his best friend, anger rising in him. "Fuck off," Scott said, and he was able to hit Taylor in the throat. Taylor was caught off guard, and Scott hit him and crushed his windpipe. Taylor stopped in his tracks. His vision blurred and then tunneled into black. His throat distorted, looking as if it had a piece missing out of it. Taylor was stopped for a moment. He tried to clear his head, his neck popping back into its normal shape. He had only dropped to one knee. Stunned, he kneeled that way for a moment. He concentrated to regain his focus. His emotions raced, but now it was apparent. Taylor would need to end this fight quickly. He rose up and his eyes flared bright red. Taylor's demeanor changed, his anger released. Tiffany's face flashed in front of his eyes. The doubt pushed aside. He would do what needed to be done. The hunter had come out. Taylor stood and looked down at Scott. Scott ran down the trail toward the bikes. Scott looked back and their eyes met. Fear rose in Scott. In all his time with Taylor, he had never seen that look on his face. Taylor's power radiated around him, and Scott was almost overwhelmed by it. Scott turned and ran as fast as he could, knowing that Taylor would soon be behind him. He hoped to get on his bike and get away. All Taylor could see was rage. Taylor finished getting up and sprinted after Scott, his legs pumping hard. Taylor caught up right as Scott got on his bike. He grabbed Scott by the shoulders and flung him through the air. He flailed in the air in a large arc. Scott landed about 15 feet away, striking a large boulder. His head snapped back against the rock, blood running down the back of his shirt. Taylor caught Scott's bike and heaved it above his head. And he turned and threw the motorcycle at his friend. The bike flew through the air and landed directly on Scott, pinning him down. Scott now bled from many wounds on his body. None were fatal yet. Scott was tired of fighting, tired of hunting. He wanted it over. Taylor walked over and looked down into the stunning blue eyes of his best friend. In the final moment, Taylor hesitated a moment. The memories of a life they had shared together, hikes and camping trips, ran through his head with every step he took. The trials they had faced together, always coming out okay, and always together. That was over. It pained them both. This time they would not be okay, and they would not get out together. "I love you," Taylor said. Scott struggled to get up but was solidly pinned down. He laid back and sneered at Taylor. "Do it and get it done," Scott spat out at him, closing his eyes and waiting. Taylor hesitated for a moment, desperate to see the old Scott one last time. Scott opened his eyes one last time and looked at Taylor. But all there was anger. Scott closed his eyes again. Taylor mustered up all his determination, a million thoughts running through his head, flashes from their childhood. In the end, he saw Tiffany in his mind. The thing below him was not his friend. Taylor lunged into Scott's chest and ripped his heart free. He dropped the heart. Scott lay lifeless with the bike still pinning him down. The tears began to flow. Taylor dropped on his knees sobbing. "Why?" he asked to no one. He looked up and his eyes were swollen red from the tears. He stood up after a moment and regained his composure the best he could. Taylor wiped his hand on Scott's shirt. "Goodbye, brother. Taylor said. He leaned down and kissed Scott on the forehead. He fished out the cell phone and called Thorane. Thorane answered. "Taylor?" he asked. "It's done," Taylor replied. "I will come to the house later. I'm right off the road at the A truck." "Consider it taken care of," Thorane replied. Taylor got on his bike and rode down the street. Instead of turning into the valley, Taylor went up Immigration Canyon. He rode well into Wyoming, letting the world pass him by. He wanted to keep going away, but sometime around 2 in the morning, he turned around and headed back toward his old home and his new life.